The piercing sound of the doorbell echoed through Marcus Chen's cramped apartment, cutting through the silence like a blade. He glanced up from the stack of overdue notices scattered across his coffee table, his heart sinking as the red "Final Warning" stamp seemed to mock him under the dim lamplight. The digital clock on his ancient microwave blinked 10:15 p.m. Who would possibly be visiting at this hour, especially during a storm that was rattling his windows with such ferocity? Marcus hesitated, his hand frozen halfway to the door. In the 3 years since his world had collapsed, unexpected visitors had meant nothing but trouble. Bill collectors, concerned social workers, or well-meaning neighbors with pitying eyes that made him feel smaller than he already did. But the doorbell rang again, more urgent this time, followed by desperate knocking that spoke of genuine need rather than threat. Through the peephole, Marcus could barely make out two figures huddled together against the torrential rain. Young women, their clothes plastered to their frames, shivering violently in the brutal downpour. Something in their posture, vulnerable, afraid, desperate, stirred a protective instinct he thought had died with his old life. "Please," a voice called through the door, barely audible over the howling wind. "We're so sorry to disturb you. We just need help." Marcus's hand moved to the deadbolt almost involuntarily. Years of hardship had taught him caution, but they hadn't completely killed his humanity. With the chain still engaged, he cracked the door open. "Can I help you?" His voice came out rougher than intended, scratched raw from disuse. He didn't talk to people much anymore. The taller of the two women looked up, and Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Her hazel eyes were pools of desperation, rimmed with exhaustion and fear that seemed to cut straight through his defenses. "Sir, please, we're so sorry," she said, words tumbling out in a rush. "Our car died about a mile north of here. We've been walking in this storm for over an hour. We've tried 8 different houses, but nobody would even come to the door. We just need to use a phone to call for help." Marcus studied them more carefully. Both appeared to be in their early 20s, clearly sisters if not twins, with matching features that spoke of shared genetics. Their expensive-looking coats and designer boots seemed wildly out of place in his rundown neighborhood, but the fear in their eyes was authentic. He'd seen enough fear in his own mirror to recognize the real thing. "The storm knocked out the cell towers," the second woman added, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "We tried everyone. Please, we're freezing." Marcus thought of his own children, Emma, now 9 years old, and little Michael, 7. Both living 2,000 miles away in Boston with their mother, growing up without him, learning to forget what his voice sounded like except through crackling video calls twice a week if he was lucky. What if they were ever stranded like this? What if they needed help and everyone turned them away? The thought made his decision for him. "Hold on." He closed the door to unhook the chain, ignoring the voice in his head screaming about bills, danger, complications. When he opened it again, the full violence of the storm hit him like a physical assault. "Come in. Get out of the rain." The relief that washed over both women's faces was so profound it nearly brought tears to Marcus's eyes. How long had it been since he'd helped someone? How long since he'd felt needed? "Thank you," they said in unison, practically stumbling into his small living room. "Thank you so much. We thought we'd have to sleep in the car." Marcus grabbed 2 towels from his bathroom, trying not to feel embarrassed by their worn, threadbare condition. Everything in his apartment told the story of a man barely surviving. Peeling wallpaper, second-hand furniture from thrift stores, a heating system that groaned and wheezed like it might give up at any moment. "Here," he said, handing them the towels. "I'm Marcus." "I'm Olivia," said the taller woman, accepting the towel like it was spun from gold. "And this is my sister, Isabella. We can't thank you enough." "Where's your car now?" Marcus asked, closing the door against the wind that seemed determined to tear his building apart. "About a mile up on Riverside Drive," Isabella replied, toweling her auburn hair. "It just started making this horrible grinding sound and completely died. We're not from this area. We were just—" She paused, exchanging a meaningful glance with her sister. "Looking at some properties for a project." Marcus noticed the exchange but didn't press. Riverside Drive wasn't exactly prime real estate territory, mostly abandoned warehouses and struggling businesses. But everyone had their secrets, and he respected privacy more than most. He certainly had enough secrets of his own. Riverside's not the safest area to be stranded at night, he said carefully. You made the right choice leaving the car. As the sisters dried off, Marcus couldn't help noticing details that didn't quite fit. Their clothes, though drenched, were clearly expensive, designer labels that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Their leather handbags looked handcrafted, the kind you saw in boutique windows but never actually touched. What were women like this doing in his neighborhood at almost 10:30 at night? The phone's in the kitchen if you want to try calling someone, he offered, pushing his curiosity aside. Whatever their story, they were genuinely in distress, and that was all that mattered. Olivia tried his landline, pressing buttons with growing frustration before setting the receiver down with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. The storm must have taken out the phone lines too. Nothing's working. Marcus felt that familiar tug in his chest, the same protective instinct that had once driven him to work killing hours trying to build a secure future for his family. The same instinct that had ultimately destroyed everything he loved. Look, he said, the words coming before he could second-guess himself. You can't go anywhere in this weather. The forecast said this storm would last until morning. You're welcome to stay here tonight. The sisters exchanged glances again, and Marcus could see the internal debate playing out across their faces. Trust a stranger or brave the storm? Neither option particularly appealing for two young women alone. We don't want to impose, Isabella said carefully, her accent carrying hints of education and privilege. You've already been so kind. You're not imposing, Marcus assured them, managing a self-deprecating smile. I've got a couch that folds out. It's not fancy, but it's dry and warm. He paused, suddenly self-conscious about his humble surroundings. Though I should warn you, breakfast options are pretty limited. I think I've got some cereal and maybe eggs. For the first time since arriving, both women smiled. Real smiles that transformed their faces completely. That sounds absolutely perfect, Olivia said, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely meant it. As Marcus helped them settle in, pulling worn sheets and thin blankets from his closet, he found himself drawn into conversation. The sisters were articulate and engaging, with a warmth that gradually began to fill the empty spaces in his apartment, spaces that had been hollow and cold for 3 long years. They asked about his work, his life, the neighborhood. Usually, Marcus avoided personal topics like they were landmines. The pain was still too raw, too immediate, too overwhelming. But something about their genuine interest, the way they listened without judgment, made words spill out that he'd kept locked away for years. I'm an architect, he heard himself saying as he made them hot tea with the last of his tea bags. Well, I was. Now I mostly do freelance drafting work when I can find it. That sounds fascinating, Isabella said, settling onto his worn couch with her hands wrapped around the warm mug. What kind of buildings did you design? Marcus's throat tightened as memories flooded back. Memories of better times, of success, of the life he'd lost. Residential mostly. Custom homes, apartment complexes. I had my own firm for a while. He didn't mention how that firm had consumed his entire existence, how his obsession with success had blinded him to what truly mattered until it was too late. What happened? Olivia asked gently, then immediately looked apologetic. Sorry, that's probably too personal. It's okay, Marcus said, surprised by his own willingness to share. The storm outside seemed to create a bubble of intimacy, making confessions feel safe. My life kind of imploded 3 years ago. Divorce. Business partnership fell apart. Had to liquidate everything just to pay the attorneys. He thought about stopping there, but something in their eyes, a compassion that seemed impossibly deep for their age, encouraged him to continue. I have 2 kids, he said quietly, the words scraping his throat raw. Emma's 9 now. Michael's 7. They live with their mother in Boston. The sisters' expressions shifted, becoming impossibly gentle. That must be incredibly difficult, Isabella said softly. Being so far from them. Marcus's vision blurred as emotion crashed over him like the storm outside. Yeah, it is. I call them twice a week, but it's not the same as being there. I miss everything. Ballet recitals, baseball games, bedtime routines. Last month, Michael lost his first tooth, and I found out 4 days later in a text message with a photo attached. His voice cracked on the last words and he turned away, embarrassed by his display of emotion in front of these young strangers. What happened with your wife? Olivia asked with infinite gentleness. Marcus took a shaky breath. Sarah said I was never present, that I cared more about building my business than building memories with my family. He paused, the truth of it still painful. She wasn't wrong. I thought I was providing for them, securing their future. But I was missing their present. By the time I realized what I was losing, it was already gone. The pain in his voice seemed to fill the small room, mixing with the sound of rain against the windows. She moved to Boston for a fresh start, Marcus continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Said she needed distance from all the memories. The court gave her primary custody. I see Emma and Michael during summer break and alternating holidays, when I can afford the plane ticket. How often is that? Isabella asked, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. This year might be the first summer I miss, Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Work's been scarce, and the custody modification attorney fees depleted most of my savings. I've been trying to put money aside, but... He gestured helplessly at the pile of bills on his kitchen table. The sisters listened with a level of empathy that seemed impossible for their age. They asked thoughtful questions, shared stories of their own childhood, and gradually Marcus felt some of the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion begin to ease. You know what strikes me about your story? Olivia said after a long moment of comfortable silence. You're still fighting for them. Even when everything collapsed, even when it would be easier to give up, you're still trying to be their father. They're my entire world, Marcus said simply. Even if I can't be with them every day, I want them to know their dad never stopped loving them, never stopped trying. As the evening wore on, Marcus learned that Olivia and Isabella were from Connecticut, both 23 and recent graduate school students. They spoke fondly of their childhood but remained vague about their family circumstances, mentioning only that their father was in development and deflecting when Marcus asked for specifics. He sensed there was much more to their story, but he respected their privacy. After all, he was a stranger who'd taken them in for the night. They didn't know him, their life history. You know, Olivia said as Marcus prepared the fold-out couch with his best sheets. We've stayed in some beautiful hotels over the years, but I don't think I've ever felt as genuinely welcome anywhere as I do right here. That's very kind of you to say, Marcus replied, tucking the sheets around the thin mattress. But I'm sure you're just being polite about my humble accommodations. No, really, Isabella insisted, her voice carrying a sincerity that made Marcus look up from his work. It's not about the place, it's about the person. You opened your door to complete strangers in the middle of a terrible storm. You shared your food, your home, your story. Not many people would do that. I have kids, Marcus said simply, the truth of it settling in his chest like a warm ember. If Emma and Michael were ever stranded somewhere, scared and alone, I'd hope someone would help them. I'd pray someone would see past their own fears and just be kind. As they settled in for the night, the sisters whispering softly to each other on the fold-out couch, Marcus lay in his own bed listening to the storm gradually losing its fury outside. For the first time in months, his small apartment didn't feel empty. The soft murmur of voices, the knowledge that he'd helped someone, the simple human connection. It all reminded him of better times when his home had been filled with laughter and family. He drifted off to sleep thinking about kindness, about the strange twists of fate that had brought these two young women to his door, and about how sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can feel like the most important things in the world. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean and started everything fresh. Marcus woke early, as was his habit from years of trying to squeeze more hours into each day. He found both sisters already awake, sitting at his kitchen table speaking in hushed, urgent tones that stopped the moment they saw him. "Good morning," he said, offering them coffee in his mismatched mugs. "How did you sleep?" "Better than we have in months," Olivia said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Something in her tone suggested she meant more than just physical rest. After a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Marcus offered to drive them back to their car. The sisters accepted, though he noticed they seemed strangely reluctant to leave, exchanging meaningful glances he couldn't interpret. During the short drive through his neighborhood, now peaceful in the morning sunlight, they were quieter than they'd been the night before. Marcus caught them looking at him in ways that made him self-conscious, as if they were memorizing his face. Their car sat exactly where they'd left it on Riverside Drive. A sleek Lexus with Connecticut plates that looked even more out of place in the rundown neighborhood in daylight. Marcus popped the hood and examined the engine, his construction background coming in handy. "Your alternators failed," he diagnosed, pointing to the problem. "It's fixable, but you'll need to have it towed to a shop. Shouldn't be too expensive." The sisters called their roadside assistance on Marcus's phone, and within 40 minutes, a tow truck arrived. As they prepared to leave with the driver, Olivia pressed something into Marcus's hand. A business card with elegant embossed lettering. "If you ever need anything," she said, her hazel eyes unusually bright with emotion. "Anything at all, please call this number." Marcus glanced at the card without really focusing on it, too caught up in the strange sadness of saying goodbye to these two young women who had briefly brought light into his dark world. "Thank you," he said, pocketing the card. "Take care of yourselves. Drive safely." As the tow truck disappeared around the corner, taking Olivia and Isabella with it, Marcus felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle back on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The brief interlude of companionship was over, and he was back to his reality of unpaid bills, empty rooms, and the crushing worry about whether he'd see his children this summer. But something had changed. Some small spark of hope had been rekindled in those few hours of human connection. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like maybe, just maybe, he could keep going. For the next 3 weeks, Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He finally landed a decent project, designing renovation plans for a small office building that would help him catch up on some bills and maybe, if he was careful with every penny, put aside enough for a plane ticket to Boston. He thought about Olivia and Isabella occasionally, wondering if they'd made it home safely. But the demands of daily survival soon pushed them to the background of his mind. The business card sat forgotten in his jeans pocket, going through the wash once before he finally pulled it out and set it on his dresser. Then, on a Thursday morning that started like any other, everything changed. Marcus was hunched over his drafting table, carefully measuring angles for the office renovation, when his doorbell rang. He glanced at the clock. 11:15 a.m. Probably a package delivery or maybe his neighbor wanting to borrow something again. He opened the door and froze. Standing on his doorstep was a distinguished man in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, flanked by Olivia and Isabella. But it wasn't their presence that made Marcus's knees go weak. It was the way they stood together, the unmistakable family resemblance, the aura of wealth and power that surrounded the older man. "Mr. Chen," the man said, extending a manicured hand with a warm smile. "My name is James Hartford. I believe you've met my daughters." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with stunning, overwhelming clarity. The expensive clothes on 2 girls stranded in his neighborhood. The vague answers about their family. The business card he barely glanced at. "You're their father," Marcus managed, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I am," James Hartford said, his grip firm and reassuring. "And I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude that I can never fully repay." Olivia stepped forward, her eyes already filling with tears. "We told him everything, Marcus. How you were the only person who helped us that night. How you opened your home to complete strangers. How kind you were even though you had so little to give. Dad wanted to come sooner, Isabella added quickly. But we asked him to wait. We needed to be certain about something first. Marcus's head was spinning. The world seemed to tilt sideways as he tried to process what was happening. Certain about what? James Hartford's smile widened, and Marcus could see where his daughters had inherited their warmth. My daughters are excellent judges of character, Mr. Chen. They insisted on doing some investigation before we approached you. Investigation? Marcus asked, confusion and growing alarm warring in his chest. About your children, Olivia said softly, her voice gentle but direct. About your custody situation, your financial struggles, your career background. Everything you shared with us that night. Marcus felt heat flood his face. His private struggles, his failures, his desperate financial situation. It had all been investigated, catalogued, probably discussed in boardrooms and family meetings. The humiliation was crushing. Please don't be angry, Isabella said quickly, seeing his expression change. We weren't trying to invade your privacy. We wanted to help the way you helped us. Help? Marcus's voice cracked. I don't understand what's happening here. James Hartford stepped forward, his expression serious but kind. Mr. Chen, I'm the CEO of Hartford Development Corporation. We specialize in commercial and residential construction projects across the East Coast. I've reviewed your architectural portfolio, what I could find of it, and I'm genuinely impressed by your work. Marcus gripped the doorframe, his knees threatening to give out. I still don't understand. What I'm about to offer you, James said carefully, is not charity. It's not pity. It's good business mixed with the recognition of exceptional character. My company is expanding, and we need talented architects who understand that buildings aren't just structures. They're dreams made concrete. The world seemed to slow down as James Hartford continued speaking. I'm offering you a position as Senior Project Architect with Hartford Development Corporation. The salary would be sufficient to allow you to relocate closer to your children in Boston and pursue joint custody if you choose. You'd be designing the kind of buildings you dreamed about, projects that matter, that last, that change communities. Marcus's vision blurred as the magnitude of what he was hearing hit him like a physical blow. That's impossible. You can't just offer someone a job because your daughters stayed at their house for one night. You're right, James said with a laugh that held no mockery, only warmth. I can't. That's not how business works. But I can offer a job to someone whose character has been thoroughly tested and proven. Do you know what my daughters told me about that night? Marcus shook his head, unable to speak. They told me about a man who had every reason to be bitter, who was struggling to survive, who could barely afford to heat his own home, and who still opened his door to strangers in a storm. They told me about someone who shared his food, his shelter, his story without asking for anything in return. Olivia wiped her eyes, but her voice was steady. Dad builds more than buildings, Marcus. He builds teams, communities, futures. And he's spent his whole life looking for people who understand that success means nothing if you don't lift others up with you. We weren't stranded by accident that night, Isabella admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. Well, the car really did break down, but we were in your neighborhood because Dad's been looking at developing some properties in this area. We'd been driving around for hours, getting a feel for the community. James nodded. When their car died and they started knocking on doors, it became an unintentional test of the neighborhood's character. 8 houses, Mr. Chen. They knocked on 8 doors before yours. 8 families who looked through their peepholes and decided not to get involved. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as the full impact hit him. How close he'd come to being number 9. How easily he could have looked through that peephole and decided he had enough problems of his own. But there's more, James continued, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a folder. Hartford Development Corporation sponsors a comprehensive educational fund for employees' children. Emma and Michael would qualify for full college scholarships when the time comes, plus tutoring support, enrichment programs, whatever they need to succeed. The folder slipped from Marcus's numb fingers, papers scattering across his doorstep like snow. He sank down onto his front step, his legs finally giving out completely. The sobs came from somewhere deep in his chest, 3 years of held-back pain and desperate hope finally breaking free. "Why?" he whispered through his tears. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Olivia knelt beside him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "Because you weren't a stranger to us when it mattered most. You were family." Isabella joined them, her own eyes wet with tears. "And because Dad taught us that success is meaningless unless you use it to change lives. That night, sitting in your kitchen listening to you talk about your children, we knew we'd found someone special." James Hartford's voice was thick with emotion. "My daughters could have called me that night. They could have used their credit cards for a hotel room. But they didn't, because sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be. That storm wasn't just weather, Mr. Chen. It was opportunity. For them to learn something profound about real kindness. And for me to find the kind of person I want representing my company." As Marcus sat there on his doorstep, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered, he thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago. Successful, driven, focused entirely on building his business while his family life crumbled around him. That man might have looked at Olivia and Isabella and seen potential clients or networking opportunities. But the man he'd become, broken, humbled, stripped of everything except his core values, had seen 2 frightened young women who needed help. And in choosing compassion over caution, kindness over fear, he'd opened a door to possibilities he never could have imagined. "There's just one condition," James said with a grin, helping Marcus to his feet. "Thanksgiving dinner is at our house this year. Olivia and Isabella insist. And when my daughters make up their minds about something, resistance is futile." Marcus laughed through his tears, the sound rusty from disuse but absolutely genuine. I accept. All of it. The job, the opportunity, the dinner invitation." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I can't believe this is real." "It's real," Olivia assured him. "And Marcus, there's something else. Dad's already spoken with one of the best family law attorneys in Massachusetts. If you want to pursue joint custody, you'll have the best legal support available." For the first time in 3 years, Marcus allowed himself to truly imagine the future. Seeing Emma and Michael more than twice a year. Being there for ballet recitals and baseball games. Tucking them in at night and reading bedtime stories in person instead of over crackling video calls. Building not just buildings but memories. Creating the life he'd always wanted but had been too focused on success to actually live. But more than that, he'd learned something precious about the ripple effects of human kindness. About how opening your door to help others really does open your heart to let blessings in. "You know what the most amazing part of this is?" Marcus said, wiping his eyes and looking at the 3 people who had just transformed his world. "I almost didn't answer the door that night. I was so exhausted, so broke, so overwhelmed by my own problems. I came this close to just ignoring the doorbell and going to sleep." "But you didn't," Isabella said softly. "When it mattered most, when 2 strangers needed help, you chose to care. And that choice," James added, "changed everything. Not just for you but for all of us. My daughters learned something about real character that night. I found the kind of employee who will help build not just my company but my legacy. And you're about to get your life back." 6 months later, Marcus Chen stood in his new office in Boston, looking out at the city skyline and thinking about the building he was about to design. A community center that would serve families like his own had been. Families struggling to hold on to hope. In the distance, he could see the elementary school where Emma and Michael would start in the fall, living with him half the time under the joint custody agreement that had finally been approved. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Dad's got a new project in Providence. Guess who's the lead architect? Also, can you make it to Sunday dinner this week? Mom's making her famous pot roast." Marcus smiled, typing back. "Wouldn't miss it. Family dinner is sacred." And it was true. Because sometimes when you open your door to strangers in a storm, you don't just give them shelter. You invite miracles into your own life. Sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't believing in tomorrow. It's believing that kindness still matters. That compassion can change everything. And that love really does find a way. The storm that brought Olivia and Isabella Hartford to Marcus's door that night had lasted only hours. But the kindness he showed them, that was going to last forever, rippling out through generations, changing lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Because in the end we're all just strangers in the storm, hoping someone will hear our knock and choose to open the door.